Hello. Today we are going to continue our lectures in portfolio management. Today our topic will be an introduction in portfolio management. In this topic we will explain some background assumption related with portfolio, and we will explain about Markowitz portfolio theory. Then we need to understand efficient volunteer and investor utility. Main objective in this topic, we need to understand how we can to maximize the profit for the investors and how we can to reduce the risk. In actual, if the investor will choose one asset to receive the profit, he will be interested to maximize the profit and minimize or reduce the risk. But how we can to reduce the risk? In this idea, we can to reduce the risk by diversification. Diversification as concept related with choose more than one asset to reduce the risk. For that, main background assumption related with this topic, how the investor maximize the return for a given level of risk. So your portfolio includes all of your assets and liabilities. For that, we need to understand the relationship between the returns for the assets. So if we understand how we can to maximize the return, then to choose the assets with given level of risk to reduce our risk. For that, we need to understand also a good portfolio is not simply a collection of individually good investment. For that, we can to reduce the risk. Maybe we would choose some assets with good investments, but we cannot to maximize our profits because the volatility in the investment related with the market. Now, if you will choose more than one assets with equal rates of return, you will choose the assets with lower level of risk. If you will choose between two assets, you will be interested to choose which assets includes lower level of risk. For that, many investors or many persons choose some assets as insurance in their life. But we need to understand this concept. Not all investors are risk averse. Why? Because some investors interest to maximize their profit. They need to expand in the market. For that, they are interested to maximize the profit with level of risk. That's mean increase some percent of risk to increase the return. For that, when we are talking about the risk, we are talking about uncertainty. There's no guarantee. If we have expectation for expected rate of return 10%, we will receive 10%. There is risk. For that, the risk related with uncertainty. Risk means uncertainty for what? For the future outcomes, for the future returns. For instance, the future value investment, an example for Google stock, is uncertain, so the investment is risky. If we have investments includes uncertainty, return direct, that investment will be a risky investment. Now, the risk related with uncertainty, to understand the risk as concept. As concept also related with probability. The risk is measured by the probability of an adverse outcome. Why? Because we have volatility in the expected rate of return. Maybe we have expected 10%, but we will receive 5%, maybe 3%, maybe 12%. For instance, there's an example, there is 40 chance you will receive return less than 8%, and you have a chance to 50% to receive 6%. That's called as probability of return. To measure the risk. Now, how we can to measure the risk? By the probability. An example, if we have 3 assets. Now, if we have 3 assets, you will choose which assets includes high return with lower risk. If you are interested to maximize your profit and reduce the risk, in this case, maybe you will choose more than one assets. That's called as diversification to reduce the risk. How we can to measure the risk? By the probability to measure the risk. In this chapter, we need to understand Markowitz portfolio theory that drives the expected rate of return for a portfolio of assets and expected risk measure. In the fact, we have meaningful measure for the portfolio risk. It's called as the variance. The variance of rate of return is meaningful measure for the portfolio. And we can derive the formula for computing the variance of the portfolio by showing how the drive to efficient diversification. Now, if we have efficient diversification, then we will receive higher return with lower risk. Main assumption for Markowitz portfolio theory. Main assumption: the investor considers the probability distribution of expected rate of return over some holding period, such as 6 months. If I have 3 assets, I need to estimate the expected rate of return for some holding period like 6 months. Second assumption: maximize one period expected utility, which demonstrate diminishing a marginal utility of worth. That's mean if I have expected for the expected rate of return for 6 months, just for one period, not more than one period. Also, we have another assumption related with Markowitz portfolio to estimate the risk of portfolio on the basis of the variability of expected rate of return. That's mean when we need to choose the assets, we will choose the assets includes variability of expected rate of return. Because if there is no variability in expected rate of return, that means there is no risk. That means there is no risk. Based decision slowly on expected rate of return and risk. Also, main assumption for Markowitz portfolio theory: the investor prefer high return for a given level of the risk, or the investor prefer less risk to more the risk. An investor prefer less risk more than more risk. But in same time, the investor prefer high return for a given risk level to maximize his investments. For that, he's interested to maximize the return and in same time to receive or to less risk to more risk. In actual, by using 5 assumptions, a single assets or portfolio assets is considered to be efficient if no other assets or portfolio of assets over high expected return with same or lower risk, or lower risk with the same or higher expected rate of return. That's mean if we have portfolio includes some assets, we can to call this as efficient portfolio if there is no any other assets includes higher return with lower risk. In this case, we can call this portfolio as efficient portfolio. Why is efficient portfolio? Because the investor will maximize his return and reduce the risk. For that, if we need to understand how we can to maximize the return and to reduce the risk, we need to understand how we can to measure the risk. We can to measure the risk by the probability of expected rate of return. Alternative measures of the risk: variance, standard deviation, covariance. All these measures to measure the risk. In actual, the variance or standard deviation or range of return returns below expectation as semi-variance. That's measure only consider deviation below the mean. All these measures we need to how we can to reduce the risk by and to maximize the return. In the fact, we have many advantages to use standard deviation as measure of the risk. If we need to look for many literature review, many empirical studies used standard deviation to measure the risk. That's used in most of the theoretical asset pricing model. Many theoretical asset pricing model use standard deviation to measure the risk. That's correct and widely recognized risk measure and give us a good index to measure the risk. How we can to calculate the expected rate of return for individual assets? Then if we have some information of we have a good knowledge to how we can to calculate the expected rate of return, it's easy to understand how we can to calculate the expected rate of return for some assets or for portfolio of assets. For individual assets, we can to calculate or computing the expected return for individual assets by probability, that's measure the risk, and possible rate of return. We can to calculate the expected rate of return by the probability for that assets multiply possible rate of return. Summation possible rate of return multiply the probability will be expected rate of return for individual assets. For that, if you want to construct a portfolio of number of risky assets to measure the expected rate of return on portfolio, if you know the expected rate of return for on each individual assets. If we need to calculate the expected rate of return for the portfolio, we need to calculate the expected rate of return for each asset. Then we can to calculate the expected rate of return for the portfolio. For that, the expected rate for the portfolio equal summation for weight average or the percent of portfolio of assets multiply the expected rate of return for each assets. Later we will understand how we can to measure the expected rate of return, how we can to measure standard deviation for the portfolio, how we can to measure the variance for the portfolio to measure the risk. An example to understand how we can to calculate expected rate of return for portfolio investment assets. In this example, we have weight average for portfolio, we have expected security return, then we have expected portfolio of return. if we need to understand expected rate of return for portfolio investment assets, it's equal to the weighted average of the expected rates of return for individual investments. Just we need to understand the weighted average for each assets. So in this class, we understand what's the meaning portfolio, how we can to reduce the risk, how we can to maximize the return by diversification. In actual, the relationship between the expected rate of return and the risk, it's very important to understand how we can to arrive or how we can to achieve the efficient portfolio. Next class, we will explain how we can to calculate the standard deviation for the portfolio, how we can to calculate the variance, what's the meaning variance, what's the meaning standard deviation, and how we can to arrive or how we can to achieve the efficient volunteer. Thank you for your attention and see you in next class.